These are 9 strategies drawn from the most dangerous minds in human history, and they explain exactly how people who get attacked, dismissed, and left behind end up winning everything. Machiavelli wrote them from a prison cell. Taleb built them on a trading floor. Greene extracted them from 3,000 years of documented human behavior. Every single one points to the same uncomfortable truth, which is that the moment your enemies start coming for you is not the beginning of your defeat, it is the beginning of your rise. Part 1. Why being opposed means you finally become a threat. In 2003, Barbara Streisand discovered that a photographer named Kenneth Adelman had posted an aerial image of her Malibu home on a coastal erosion documentation website. And before she made a single move, that photo had been downloaded exactly 6 times, 2 of which were by her own legal team. She sued him for $50 million. By the time the lawsuit became public, over 420,000 people had visited the site to see that photo. The court declared her the loser, and she walked away owing Adelman $177,000 in legal fees, all for the privilege of making herself the most talked about person on the internet that month. This is now called the Streisand effect, a term coined on January 5, 2005, by Mike Masnick of the blog TechDirt. What it describes is something the powerful have always understood and the insecure have always forgotten, and that is this: when you try to suppress something, you announce that it matters. When you try to silence someone, you tell the world they are worth listening to. The psychology behind it carries a name: psychological reactance, and scholars define it plainly as the pattern where being denied access to something makes people want it more. The forbidden becomes irresistible. The attempted suppression creates a curiosity gap that pulls people in harder than any promotion ever could. Robert Greene understood this well enough to make it Law 6 of the 48 Laws of Power, where the principle holds that notoriety beats obscurity every single time, that bad publicity is still publicity, and that being slandered and attacked is preferable to being ignored. Machiavelli watched it play out across decades of Italian politics and reached the same conclusion, namely that rulers who were contested and resisted became historically significant, while rulers who went unchallenged faded into nothing. Research published in 2006 by psychologists Brendan Nehan and Jason Riefler added another layer to this, what they called the backfire effect, which is the documented pattern where challenging someone's deeply held beliefs with contradictory evidence doesn't weaken those beliefs, it strengthens them. Challenge builds conviction, opposition builds identity, and if no one is opposing you yet, that means you haven't built anything worth opposing. Part 2. The Strategy of the Void. How aggressive silence destroys your enemies. Most people, when attacked, respond immediately, and every time they do, they lose a little more ground. They explain, they defend, they argue, they clarify, they post and reply, and call and justify. And each move costs them more than the attack itself ever did. Law 4 of the 48 Laws of Power states that powerful people know how to impress others by saying less, that the more you say, the more likely you are to say something foolish, and that short answers and silence push people into a defensive posture where they scramble to fill the quiet. In that scrambling, they expose their fears, their motivations, their weak points, all the information you can use without ever having to ask for it. The attention people give to your brief comments adds to your power, Greene notes, because later they'll obsess over every word and its possible implications, turning a 5-word response into a paragraph in their own mind. Andy Warhol built one of the most recognizable artistic brands of the 20th century almost entirely on this principle. Deliberately keeping his comments vague, his answers minimal, and his silences long, which meant people projected meaning onto him, constructing a mythology larger than anything he ever claimed. Machiavelli captured the mechanism from a different angle in chapter 18 of The Prince, writing that men judge more by sight than by feeling, that everyone can see what you appear to be, but few can test what you actually are, and those few rarely dare stand against the general opinion. What this means in practice is that you are not what you say, you are what people believe, and what people believe is shaped almost entirely by what you choose to reveal. Reveal nothing, and they construct something greater. Reveal everything, and they reduce you to exactly what you've shown them. Silence is not absence from this fight. It is armor. It is information control at its most aggressive. And while your opponents talk and explain and expose themselves trying to fill the quiet you created, you are watching, listening, and accumulating everything you need. Part 3. Machiavelli's most dangerous lesson. Concealing your true intentions. Born in Florence on May 3rd, 1469, Niccolò Machiavelli held two of the most sensitive political positions in the Florentine Republic by 1498, serving as head of the Second Chancery and secretary to the Dieci di Libertà e Pace, the 10 of Liberty and Peace, which oversaw military and foreign affairs. 14 years of negotiating with kings, watching alliances collapse, and studying Cesare Borgia operate gave him something closer to surgical precision than political opinion, and he used all of it when the Medici returned to Florence in 1512, threw him out, accused him of conspiracy he had nothing to do with, and imprisoned him in the Bargello. What followed was the strappado 6 times, a torture method where a prisoner's arms are tied behind their back. They are hoisted into the air, then dropped suddenly to a halt by the rope, which dislocates the shoulders. He endured it without confessing, wrote sonnets about it afterward, and was eventually released under a papal amnesty when Giovanni de' Medici became Pope Leo X in March 1513. Exiled to his family's farm at Sant'Andrea in Percasina, 7 miles south of Florence, forbidden from politics, stripped of everything he'd built across 14 years, he drafted the most dangerous book in Western political history between July and December of that same year. Chapter 18 of The Prince lays out what he observed: that princes who kept their word consistently were overcome by princes who learned to beguile minds through cunning, that appearances should be deliberately deceptive, and that a ruler who cannot manage this has already handed his opponents an advantage they will use. His words were direct. It is necessary to know how to conceal this characteristic well, and to be a great pretender and dissembler. He frames it through the lion and the fox, where the lion's strength cannot detect traps, and the fox's cunning cannot fight wolves, which means anyone who wants to survive needs both, and the fox becomes useless the moment everyone knows where it hides. His case study was Cesare Borgia, who had sworn enemies in the Orsini family and neutralized them not through confrontation but through warmth, sending gifts of money, clothes, and horses until they accepted an invitation to Senegalia, where he had their leaders killed and absorbed their followers. Machiavelli witnessed this diplomatically, and he held it up not as a cautionary tale, but as the correct approach. Greene built on this in Law 3, noting that the error most people make is going quiet in a way that signals secrecy, which raises suspicion immediately. The better move is to talk freely and openly about your desires and goals, just never the real ones, using decoys and familiar distractions so the concealment lives inside apparent openness, which is exactly where it does the most damage. Part 4. Antifragile. How to Gain Strength from Every Attack. Published on November 27, 2012, Nassim Taleb's Antifragile was the 4th volume of his Inserto series, following Fooled by Randomness in 2001, The Black Swan in 2007, which the Sunday Times named one of the 12 most influential books since World War II, and The Bed of Procrustes in 2010. The central argument cuts straight through the conventional two-category way of thinking about stress, where things either break or resist, by identifying a third category that existing language had no word for: things that don't just resist disorder but improve because of it. Taleb called this antifragile, and the definition he published in a formal letter to Nature in 2013 is precise. The resilient resists shocks and stays the same, and the antifragile gets better. He laid it out in a triad built around mythology, where Damocles, sitting under a sword suspended by a single hair, represents the fragile. A single wrong move, and everything ends. The phoenix represents the robust, burning to ash and returning to exactly what it was before. Same size, same capability, nothing gained. The hydra represents something different entirely, because cutting off one head produces two, which means the attack doesn't diminish it. The attack multiplies it. Hercules could only stop the hydra by cauterizing each stump immediately after cutting, eliminating the capacity to regenerate before it could begin. And that detail matters because it contains the rule in reverse. As long as you survive an attack without letting your opponent cauterize the wound, you come back with more than you had before it landed. Taleb captured the underlying principle this way: wind extinguishes a candle and energizes fire. Likewise with randomness, uncertainty, chaos. You want to use them, not hide from them. A medical concept called hormesis runs beneath this, where small doses of a stressor that would be harmful in large amounts actually build resilience when applied carefully, which is why muscles broken down through weight training rebuild stronger, why vaccines create immunity, and why small failures make experienced people harder to break than protected ones. The practical tool Taleb offers for building this quality is the barbell strategy, where you combine extreme safety on one end with extreme risk-taking on the other, and abandon the middle zone entirely, because medium risks carry invisible downside that can't be calculated. 90% in ultra-safe assets, and 10% in highly speculative bets. A stable foundation paired with calculated exposure to large upside, while avoiding the comfortable middle ground that looks balanced and isn't. His framing of it, for anti-fragility, is the combination of aggressiveness plus paranoia. Clip your downside, protect yourself from extreme harm, and let the upside, the positive black swans, take care of itself. Part 5. The Art of Division. Dismantling a hostile group without fighting. 14 years of diplomatic work taught Machiavelli one thing about enemies that almost nobody in modern life applies with any consistency, which is that a united enemy is not slightly more dangerous than a divided one. It is dramatically more dangerous, and the gap between those two states is where the real strategic opportunity lives. Florence's own Florentine histories gave him the domestic example: a city torn apart by what he called destructive factionalism, internal division that left it fragmented and morally decayed, and he understood from the inside exactly what that internal conflict did to a group's capacity to function. Chapter 20 of The Prince carries the tactical conclusion. A smart ruler provokes hostility strategically, so that crushing it afterward builds reputation. You don't attack the group. You engineer its collapse from within, without ever being seen as the one who struck first. Greene builds out the mechanics in Law 33, the instruction to discover each person's fatal weakness, because every individual inside a hostile group operates from different fears and different desires, and those differences are the fault lines you're looking for. Pull at them from different angles, and the group tears itself apart at the seams, without you having to touch it directly. Envy is already inside every group, and it doesn't need to be created, only activated. Greene's observation is that occasionally displaying small flaws and admitting harmless vices redirects that envy inward, making members of the hostile group compete against each other over whose criticism of you lands hardest, which means their energy flows away from you and into each other. He adds the warning that doubt, once released through well-placed rumors, puts opponents in a position where every move they make looks suspicious to their own allies. Law 2 adds the conversion element, where a former enemy brought into your circle is often more useful than a loyal ally, because they carry more to prove. They understand your capabilities from direct experience, and their departure from the hostile group fractures it at the same moment their arrival strengthens yours. Part 6. The Weaponization of Success. The only revenge that actually works. Machiavelli's image of fortune was a flooding river, and the people who drowned in it were the ones who stood in the open with no preparation done, while the ones who survived had built embankments in calm weather before the water rose. His conclusion in The Prince was unambiguous. Make mistakes of ambition, not mistakes of sloth. Develop the strength to do bold things rather than the strength to suffer, and understand that prudence isn't about avoiding risk, but about calculating it and moving decisively. Law 9 of the 48 Laws of Power carries the same logic into direct application, stating that actions and visible results dismantle critics more completely than any argument ever could. Arguing with someone who attacked you places you at their level. Succeeding visibly and undeniably leaves them with nothing left to say, because the argument was already over before you opened your mouth. Taleb frames this mathematically. When others try to break you, and you come out stronger, the growth you generate is asymmetric compared to the energy they spent trying to damage you. They invested in your destruction and got nothing back. Your energy went into building, and it compounded. The Hydra principle applied to a person's life means that every attack you survived without being finished didn't leave you where you started. 2 heads grew back, more skill, more clarity, more capability than existed before the attack landed. The poet George Herbert captured something like this, long before any of these books existed, when he wrote that living well is the best revenge, and what Machiavelli, Greene, and Taleb collectively demonstrate is the actual mechanism behind that idea, not as something that happens despite your enemies, but as something that results directly from what they forced you through. Part 7. Amor Fati. How to love the resistance and become untouchable. Friedrich Nietzsche spent most of his adult life in chronic, debilitating pain, dealing with severe migraines, deteriorating vision, and digestive illness that kept him bedridden for months at a time. Writing from rented rooms across Switzerland, France, and Italy in social isolation, with little money and an audience that largely ignored him during his lifetime. In 1882, from inside those conditions, he introduced a Latin phrase in a book called The Gay Science that would become one of the most referenced ideas in modern philosophy. Amor Fati, love of fate, appeared in The Gay Science first, and then in his final work, Ecce Homo, written in 1888 before his mental collapse in January 1889, where he defined it this way: my formula for greatness in a human being is Amor Fati. That one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely bear what is necessary, still less conceal it, but love it. The phrase itself belongs to Nietzsche, coined in the 19th century, but the concept behind it runs much older, through 3 Stoic philosophers who practiced it without ever naming it that way. Marcus Aurelius wrote his private journal, never intending it for publication, while governing Rome through constant war and plague from 161 to 180 CE, watching most of his children die before him. And in Meditations he recorded this: a blazing fire makes flame and brightness out of everything that is thrown into it. Not some things, not the manageable ones, everything. Epictetus was born into slavery around 50 CE, physically crippled by his enslaver, and went on to teach philosophy to some of the most powerful men in Rome. A life that demonstrated Amor Fati before Nietzsche had a name for it. His Enchiridion carries the instruction plainly: do not seek for things to happen the way you want them to, but wish instead that what happens, happens the way it happens, and then you will be happy. Seneca, who advised Emperor Nero, and was eventually forced by Nero to take his own life in 65 CE, put it this way: the bravest sight in the world is a great man struggling against adversity. Taleb draws a direct line between this Stoic framework and anti-fragility, describing what he calls Seneca's barbell, where Seneca mentally wrote off his possessions as already lost, so that actual losses cost him nothing emotionally when they arrived. He had already processed it. What came next was confirmation of what he'd accepted, which made him functionally untouchable, not because nothing could harm him, but because he had removed the emotional leverage that harm required to break a person. Taleb's line connecting the two traditions: just as Stoicism is the domestication of emotion, the barbell strategy is the domestication of uncertainty. Part 8. The Alliance of One. Achieving total self-reliance. Machiavelli's sharpest military critique was aimed at mercenaries, paid soldiers with no loyalty and no stake in the outcome, and his assessment was direct. Mercenaries are useless and dangerous. They are undisciplined, cowardly, and without any loyalty, being motivated only by money. Florence's dependence on them was, in his view, the root of its military weakness, and the structural lesson he drew from it applied far beyond armies, which was that any prince who relies on others remains permanently at their mercy, and the moment those others find a better offer, a safer position, or simply lose interest, the power built on that dependence collapses. Greene's Law 11 approaches the same principle from the opposite direction, where true self-reliance means becoming the source that others depend on, rather than eliminating dependence entirely. Building something unique, irreplaceable, and necessary means others cannot afford to lose you. And that inversion of dependency is where sustainable power actually lives. Law 18 adds the counterintuitive warning that building fortress-like isolation makes you weaker, not stronger, because you lose access to information, shifting alliances, and early signals of incoming threats. And what protects you from plotters is the mobility to move through different circles rather than walls keeping the world out. Taleb's economic case for the same principle runs through his comparison of a self-employed taxi driver to a salaried bank employee. Conventional thinking puts the taxi driver in the riskier position, and Taleb dismantles that assumption by pointing out that the taxi driver cannot be fired overnight, gets direct market feedback, and can adapt immediately, learns something from every small mistake, and carries no single catastrophic point of failure. The bank employee appears stable right until the moment they don't, at which point they have no adaptive capacity, no experience navigating uncertainty, and no buffer built from managing volatility over time. His test for the anti-fragile individual: if I have nothing to lose, then it is all gain and I am anti-fragile. Part 9. The Return. How to handle those who come crawling back. There is always a return, and it follows one of the most consistent patterns in documented human behavior, where the people who doubted you appear again after you've proven something. The ones who abandoned you reintroduce themselves after you've succeeded, and the enemies who attacked you come back quieter and warmer, with explanations and apologies, and almost everyone receiving that return makes the same mistake of lowering their guard completely. Machiavelli never moralizes about forgiveness. The only question he asks is whether forgiving a specific person increases or decreases your security. And his foundational rule runs like this: people should either be caressed or crushed. If you do them minor damage, they will get their revenge. But if you cripple them, there is nothing they can do. The corollary is that if you chose at some earlier point not to finish them, then what matters when they return is a single structural question, which is whether they return with the capacity to harm you if the relationship sours again. If they do, then the warmth of their return, the sincerity of their words, and the apparent change in their manner are all beside the point. Law 15 of the 48 Laws of Power states it without softening. All great leaders since Moses have known that a feared enemy must be crushed completely. If one ember is left alight, no matter how dimly it smolders, a fire will eventually break out. More is lost through stopping halfway than through total annihilation. The enemy will recover and will seek revenge. Greene is careful to clarify that crushing doesn't mean physical harm, but means weakening someone enough that the kind of recovery leading to renewed threat becomes impossible. And his historical case for this is the Byzantine Emperor Michael III, who gave power, money, and total trust to his best friend Basilius, a former horse groomer who had once saved his life, and Basilius accumulated enough power to refuse repaying his debts to Michael and eventually had him killed. None of this means every returning person is a threat to be neutralized, because Law 2 carries the productive version of this moment. A former enemy who returns can become your most useful ally, more loyal than a friend because they have more to prove. They understand your capabilities from direct experience, and they know they lost. The determining factor is always structural, whether their loyalty is now binding because they owe you, need you, and have genuine skin in the game, or whether it is purely emotional, which is the most fragile kind and the easiest to abandon when circumstances shift. 9 strategies, 1 coherent philosophy, and 1 central truth about where power actually comes from and what it actually requires. Opposition signals that you've become real. Silence gives your opponents nothing to aim at, while they give you everything you need. Concealment preserves your options until the moment you decide to use them. Antifragility converts every attack into capability, every wound into regeneration, every attempt to end you into 2 heads where one was cut. Division removes threats before they mature into confrontations. Success functions as the argument that cannot be rebutted. Amor Fati strips adversity of the emotional leverage it needs to break you. Self-Reliance removes the structural vulnerabilities others can exploit. And when the people who underestimated you return, you already know the only question worth asking. Machiavelli wrote The Prince in Exile at Sant'Andrea in Percasina in 1513. Having survived torture, dismissal, and a ban from the political life he'd built across 14 years, trying to win his way back into relevance, he never made it back. But the book he produced in that exile shaped how every serious student of power has thought and operated for 500 years since. Taleb watched fortunes disappear in financial markets, including his own, and turned that experience into a philosophy of building systems that grow stronger precisely because they face volatility rather than avoid it. Greene spent years in obscurity working approximately 50 jobs, watching power operate at close range in Hollywood, and publishing and every corridor where real decisions get made. And he distilled 3,000 years of documented human behavior into 48 patterns that the powerful have always known and rarely shared. 3 different centuries, 3 different disciplines, 3 different entry points into the same portrait of a person. Someone who stands alone, gets opposed, refuses to run from the chaos, removes every dependency that could be used against them, says less than their enemies expect, conceals more than they can track, converts every wound into regeneration, and uses their own success as the only statement that ultimately matters. That person doesn't win eventually. They were already winning the moment the opposition began.